500 years before the airplane, he drew flying machines. 3 centuries before modern anatomy textbooks, he mapped the human heart with terrifying precision. He painted a smile so mysterious that millions still stand in line just to see it for 30 seconds. Leonardo da Vinci was not simply a genius. He was a man whose mind existed in a future the rest of humanity hadn't reached yet. But here's what they don't tell you in art class. He was also a failure by most standards of his time. He left more projects unfinished than completed. He was called lazy, unreliable, obsessive. He dissected corpses in secret, wrote backward in code, and died believing he had wasted his life. So why do we remember him as the ultimate Renaissance man? Because Leonardo didn't just observe the world, he dismantled it, piece by piece, searching for the invisible laws that held everything together. From the curve of a woman's smile to the spiral of water draining from a basin, from the anatomy of a sparrow's wing to the geometry of human beauty itself, nothing escaped his hunger to understand. This is the story of how a bastard child from a Tuscan hillside became the closest thing humanity has ever produced to a universal mind. April 15th, 1452. A Saturday night in the village of Anciano, just outside the town of Vinci in the Tuscan hills. A notary named Ser Piero da Vinci had an affair with a young peasant woman named Caterina. 9 months later, she gave birth to a boy they named Leonardo. Illegitimate. A bastard. In Renaissance Italy, this meant Leonardo could never inherit his father's profession, could never become a notary or lawyer, could never attend university. The doors that opened easily for legitimate sons slammed shut before he even learned to walk. But here's the strange fortune hidden in that misfortune. Because he couldn't follow the traditional path, Leonardo was free to invent his own. While his half-brothers studied Latin and law in stuffy classrooms, Leonardo roamed the countryside around Vinci. He watched hawks circling overhead and studied how they banked into turns without flapping. He lay on his stomach by the Arno River and observed how water swirled around rocks, how it formed eddies and whirlpools, how it carved the landscape over centuries. He dissected dead animals he found in the fields, not with disgust, but with intense curiosity. What made a bird's wing work? Why did the heart have chambers? How did muscles attach to bone? This was Leonardo's real education, and it was happening in muddy fields and riverbanks, not in libraries. His grandfather, Antonio, recognized something unusual in the boy. He noted in a family record that Leonardo was clever with his hands, that he could draw anything he saw with startling accuracy. When Ser Piero remarried a woman from a good Florentine family and moved to the city, he took Leonardo with him. And this is where the story truly begins. Florence in the 1460s was the epicenter of human achievement. The Medici family, wealthy bankers who ruled the city, had turned Florence into a magnet for artists, architects, philosophers, and scientists. Brunelleschi had just completed the impossible dome of the cathedral. Donatello's sculptures brought marble to life. Masaccio had discovered perspective, the mathematical trick that made flat paintings look three-dimensional. The air itself seemed to crackle with ambition and innovation. Ser Piero knew his bastard son couldn't become a professional like him, but the boy could draw. So at age 14, Leonardo was apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's most successful artists. Verrocchio's workshop was not what you imagine when you think of an art studio. It was more like a factory, a collaborative business where dozens of young men learned to work with bronze, marble, wood, paint, and gold. They made sculptures, altarpieces, suits of armor, festival decorations, and church bells. Verrocchio himself was an engineer as much as an artist, a man who understood how pulleys and levers worked, how to cast a bronze statue weighing thousands of pounds, how to calculate the proportions that made a figure look natural. Leonardo absorbed everything. He learned to grind pigments, stretch canvases, mix tempera and oil paints. He studied the human figure by drawing live models hour after hour. He learned the mathematics of perspective, the chemistry of materials, the business of negotiating with wealthy patrons. But even among talented apprentices, Leonardo stood out. There's a famous story about a painting Verrocchio was working on in the early 1470s, the Baptism of Christ. Verrocchio painted most of the composition himself, but he assigned the young Leonardo to paint one of the angels in the corner. When Verrocchio saw what his apprentice had done, he was reportedly so stunned by the beauty and technical skill that he put down his brushes and never painted again. The story is probably exaggerated, but the angel Leonardo painted is still there, and even now you can see the difference. Leonardo's angel has a softness, a luminosity, a sense of inner life that makes everything around it look wooden and stiff. He was 20 years old, and he had already surpassed his master. He would begin a painting and then abandon it to study mathematics or pursue some obscure question about optics. His mind moved faster than his hands, and his curiosity was too vast to be contained by any single project. In 1482, at age 30, Leonardo made a fateful decision. He left Florence, the center of the art world, and headed north to Milan. Why? Because he was bored. Because he wanted more than commissions for pretty altarpieces. Because he had bigger dreams than painting portraits of wealthy merchants. He wrote a letter to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, offering his services. And this letter reveals everything about how Leonardo saw himself. He barely mentioned painting. Instead, he listed his skills as a military engineer. He could design portable bridges for armies, cannons that fired multiple shots, armored vehicles, catapults, tunnels for sieges. Almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that he could also paint and sculpt. The Renaissance was not a peaceful time. Italy was a patchwork of city-states, constantly at war with each other. And rulers like Ludovico needed engineers who could build weapons as much as they needed artists who could glorify their courts. Leonardo was offering to become both. Milan was darker than Florence, colder, more militaristic. Where Florence celebrated beauty and classical learning, Milan was about power and pragmatism. Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro because of his dark complexion, had seized control of the duchy through cunning and force. He wanted to transform Milan into a glittering Renaissance court to rival Florence, Rome, and Venice. He needed artists, architects, and engineers to build his vision. And he needed someone who could do all three. Leonardo spent 17 years in Milan, from 1482 to 1499, and these were some of the most productive and strange years of his life. He designed weapons that were centuries ahead of their time. In his notebooks, you can find sketches of a tank, a helicopter, a submarine, a machine gun. These weren't fantasies. Leonardo was working from principles of engineering that wouldn't be fully understood until the modern era. His tank design used hand cranks to move a circular armored shell with cannons protruding from all sides. His helicopter was based on the Archimedean screw, rotating blades that would compress air downward to generate lift. His machine gun was a rotating array of barrels that would allow continuous fire while others reloaded. None of these were built in his lifetime, but not because they were impossible. Most failed because the materials of the Renaissance, wood, rope, bronze, couldn't withstand the forces his designs required. He was sketching a future made of steel and gasoline, while living in a world of leather and horseflesh. But Ludovico didn't hire Leonardo just to dream. He wanted practical results. Leonardo designed canals and irrigation systems to improve agriculture. He created elaborate stage machinery for court festivals, including a mechanical lion that walked across a floor and opened its chest to reveal lilies, the symbol of France. He painted portraits of Ludovico's mistresses. He organized architectural competitions. He was, in modern terms, a one-man creative agency, equally comfortable with art, engineering, urban planning, and entertainment. Yet, the project that consumed him most was a massive bronze equestrian statue, a monument to Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. Leonardo planned to cast a horse and rider over 24 feet tall, the largest bronze sculpture ever attempted. He spent years studying horses, measuring their proportions, sketching them from every angle. He developed a revolutionary casting technique that would pour the bronze in a single session to avoid weak seams. He built a full-scale clay model. And then, nothing. The bronze that had been set aside for the statue was requisitioned to make cannons when Milan went to war with France. The clay model was used for target practice by French soldiers when they invaded Milan in 1499. Leonardo never cast the horse. It became one of the great unrealized masterpieces of his life, a symbol of his tragic pattern, extraordinary preparation, meticulous planning, and then circumstances or his own perfectionism preventing completion. But there was one project from the Milan years that Leonardo did finish, and it changed art forever: The Last Supper. In 1495, Ludovico commissioned Leonardo to paint a mural in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia. The subject was the moment when Jesus tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. Religious art had depicted this scene countless times, usually showing the apostles seated in a row with Judas isolated on the opposite side of the table, clearly marked as the villain. Leonardo did something radically different. He painted the psychological explosion of that instant. Imagine you're sitting at dinner with your closest friends, and someone says, "One of you is going to betray me." The shock, the confusion, the denial, the fear, the anger, all of that erupts simultaneously. Leonardo captured 12 different reactions in 12 different faces. One apostle recoils in horror. Another leans forward in disbelief. Peter grabs a knife. James throws his arms wide in innocence. Judas, instead of being separated, is right there among them, clutching a bag of silver coins, his face shadowed with guilt, but not obviously evil. Every gesture, every facial expression is psychologically precise. Leonardo was painting not just a moment from scripture, but the entire spectrum of human emotion under crisis. And the technique he used was revolutionary. Traditional frescoes were painted on wet plaster, which meant artists had to work fast before the plaster dried. Leonardo hated working fast. He wanted to layer glazes, make adjustments, rework faces until they were perfect. So he invented his own technique, a hybrid of tempera and oil applied to a dry wall. This allowed him to work slowly, to return day after day to refine details. The monks complained that Leonardo would sometimes stand in front of the mural for hours without touching a brush, just staring. Other times he would rush in, make a single brushstroke, and leave. He was thinking through every decision, and the result was a masterpiece of psychological drama. But there was a catastrophic problem. Leonardo's experimental technique didn't bond properly to the wall. Within his own lifetime, The Last Supper began to flake and deteriorate. 500 years of humidity, wars, and clumsy restorations have left it a ghostly shadow of what it once was. Yet even in its damaged state, the power of the composition is undeniable. It remains one of the most famous images in Western art. Why? Because Leonardo didn't just illustrate a Bible story. He painted the human soul under pressure. During these Milan years, Leonardo also pursued his private obsessions. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, sketches, questions. How does the tongue of a woodpecker work? Why is the sky blue? Can you square a circle? What is the origin of rivers? He sketched grotesque faces he saw in the street, fascinated by the extremes of beauty and ugliness. He drew machinery, architecture, knots, plants, storms, mountains, and anatomy. These notebooks were written in mirror script, from right to left, possibly because Leonardo was left-handed and it was more natural, or possibly because he wanted to keep his ideas secret. They weren't meant for publication. They were his private laboratory, a written record of a mind that never stopped dissecting the world. And then, in 1499, Leonardo's world collapsed. The French army invaded Milan. Ludovico Sforza fled.
Leonardo's great bronze horse was destroyed. The artist was suddenly without a patron, without income, without a home. At age 47, Leonardo was forced to wander Italy looking for work, like a journeyman a third his age. He spent time in Venice, designing naval defenses against Turkish invasion. He returned briefly to Florence. He worked for the notorious warlord Cesare Borgia as a military engineer, traveling through central Italy, mapping fortresses and designing weapons. He was a genius for hire, constantly moving, never quite settling. But it was during this period of instability that Leonardo's true scientific work began in earnest. Because when the military contracts dried up, Leonardo turned inward to the ultimate mystery: the human body. Picture this. It's sometime around 1508. Leonardo is in his 50s, living in Milan again under French occupation, late at night, in a cold room lit only by candles. He is bent over the corpse of a man who died hours earlier. The body is starting to stiffen. The smell is overwhelming. Leonardo works fast. He has a set of knives, saws, hooks, and pins spread out on a table beside him. He makes an incision down the chest, peels back the skin, and begins to carefully dissect the layers of muscle, tracing each one to see where it attaches to bone. He sketches as he goes, his left hand moving rapidly across paper while his right hand holds the scalpel. This was illegal. The Catholic Church controlled the disposal of bodies, and dissection of human corpses was forbidden except under very specific circumstances. Leonardo didn't care. He had dissected animals since childhood, but animal anatomy could only teach him so much. If he wanted to understand how the human body really worked, how the heart pumped blood, how the lungs expanded, how the eye perceived light, he had to see it for himself. Over the course of his life, Leonardo dissected more than 30 human bodies. He performed these autopsies wherever he could find corpses: hospitals, morgues, monasteries. He worked in secret, often at night, racing against decomposition. And what he discovered revolutionized human understanding of anatomy. Start with the heart. For over 1,000 years, European medicine had been based on the ancient Greek physician Galen, who had never dissected a human body and had made many errors. Galen believed the heart had 2 chambers and that blood passed through invisible pores in the wall between them. Leonardo's dissections proved this was wrong. He identified 4 chambers in the heart. He traced the major arteries and veins. He even made glass models of the heart and pumped water and seeds through them to study the flow patterns. He was the first person to correctly describe the heart's structure and to understand that it was a pump, not a furnace, as Galen had claimed. But here's the astonishing part. Leonardo didn't just document anatomy. He tried to understand why the body was designed the way it was. He noticed that the structure of bones, muscles, and tendons followed principles of leverage and mechanical efficiency. The human body was a machine, but a machine of extraordinary elegance. The shoulder joint was a ball and socket design that allowed maximum range of motion. The spine was a flexible column that balanced the skull while absorbing shocks. The foot was an arch, distributing weight and providing spring. Leonardo filled page after page with anatomical drawings that are still used in medical schools today. His sketches of the skeleton, muscles, nerves, and organs are not only scientifically accurate, but also stunningly beautiful. He drew the fetus in the womb, curled like a seed, surrounded by the placenta's intricate vascular system. He drew the layers of the scalp, the chambers of the eye, the branching pathways of nerves. But Leonardo's investigations went beyond anatomy.
He became obsessed with the deeper patterns that connected everything in nature. He noticed that water flowing in a river moved in spirals, and that the same spirals appeared in the curls of human hair. He observed that the branching structure of trees mirrored the branching of veins and arteries. He studied the geometry of plants and discovered the Fibonacci sequence in the arrangement of leaves around a stem, though he didn't have the mathematical language to describe it fully. He was searching for what he called the mathematical principles underlying all natural forms. This is where Leonardo intersects with one of his most famous images, the Vitruvian Man. You've seen it, a naked man with arms and legs outstretched, inscribed in both a circle and a square. It's become a symbol of Renaissance humanism, the idea that the human being is the measure of all things. But for Leonardo, it was more than symbolism. It was a scientific diagram.
The Roman architect Vitruvius had written that the proportions of the human body reflect perfect geometry. A man's arm span equals his height. The navel is the center of a circle traced by outstretched limbs. The distance from hairline to chin is 1/10 the body's height, and so on. Leonardo was testing whether Vitruvius was right. He measured countless bodies and made minute adjustments to Vitruvius's ratios. The result was a drawing that fused art, anatomy, geometry, and philosophy. It declared that the human body was not a random collection of parts, but a mathematical expression of universal order. For Leonardo, everything was connected. The laws that governed the human heart also governed the flow of rivers. The geometry that made a face beautiful was the same geometry that structured a flower. The spiral of a seashell echoed the spiral of a storm. He was trying to see through the surface chaos of the world to the elegant code beneath. And this is why Leonardo's notebooks are so overwhelming and so frustrating. They jump from topic to topic with no clear organization. One page shows the anatomy of the lips, the next a design for a canal lock, the next a study of cloud formations. To a modern reader, it looks chaotic. But in Leonardo's mind, it was all the same project, understanding how nature works. His method was to observe without prejudice, to question every assumption, to trust only what his own eyes and hands could verify. This made him a scientist in the truest sense, even though the word scientist didn't exist yet. But there was a dark side to this relentless curiosity. Leonardo was so obsessed with understanding that he often lost sight of finishing. He would start a painting, then abandon it halfway because he became fascinated by a question about light or anatomy. He filled thousands of pages of notes, but never published them.
His discoveries in anatomy, hydraulics, optics, and mechanics died with him, hidden in private notebooks that were scattered and lost for centuries. Other men would later rediscover what Leonardo had already known and would get the credit. Leonardo's genius was real, but it was also tragically isolated. He was a man speaking a language no one around him fully understood. Leonardo returned to Florence in 1503, after nearly 20 years away. The city had changed. The Medici had been expelled in a Republican revolution. A fanatical monk named Savonarola had led a brief theocracy, burning books and artworks in the bonfire of the vanities, before being executed himself. Florence was now a republic again, proud, unstable, and fiercely competitive. And there was a new star in town. Michelangelo Buonarroti was 23 years younger than Leonardo, and his rise had been meteoric. His sculpture of David, unveiled in 1504, had made him the most famous artist in Italy. Where Leonardo was soft-spoken, enigmatic, and elusive, Michelangelo was loud, aggressive, and prolific. Where Leonardo painted with delicate glazes and sfumato, Michelangelo carved with brutal force and terrifying skill. The two men despised each other. The rivalry came to a head in 1504 when the Florentine government commissioned both artists to paint enormous battle scenes on opposite walls of the city council hall. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory over Milan. Michelangelo was assigned the Battle of Cascina, a Florentine victory over Pisa. It was supposed to be the ultimate artistic showdown, the old master versus the young genius. Both men prepared elaborate cartoons, full-scale drawings, showing chaotic, violent compositions filled with struggling horses and warriors. Leonardo's cartoon showed a furious fight over a battle standard,
with men and horses tangled in a knot of rage and desperation. Michelangelo's showed soldiers surprised while bathing, scrambling to arm themselves as the enemy attacked. These cartoons were put on public display, and people came from all over Italy to see them. They were studied by every young artist in Florence. Raphael, just starting his career, copied figures from both. The cartoons themselves became masterpieces. But neither artist finished the actual paintings. Leonardo started his battle scene, but once again experimented with an untested technique, trying to paint with oils on a wall treated with heat. The paint began to run and smudge. Frustrated, Leonardo abandoned the project. Michelangelo was called away to Rome by the Pope before he could start painting. Both walls remained unfinished. The cartoons were eventually destroyed or lost. All that survives are copies and descriptions, tantalizing ghosts of what might have been the greatest artistic duel in history. But even while failing to complete the Battle of Anghiari, Leonardo was working on something that would outlast everything else: a portrait of a woman, commissioned by a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. Her name was Lisa Gherardini. Today, we call the painting the Mona Lisa. Here's the strange thing about the Mona Lisa. It's small, less than 3 feet tall. It's a simple portrait, just a woman sitting with her hands folded, looking at the viewer. There's no dramatic action, no religious symbolism, no mythological narrative. And yet, it is the most famous painting in the world. Why? Start with the technique. Leonardo painted in layers, building up the image with translucent glazes so thin that modern X-rays can barely detect them. He used sfumato, a technique of blending tones so softly that there are no hard edges. Look at the corners of Lisa's mouth and eyes. You can't pinpoint exactly where the shadow begins. This ambiguity is what gives her expression its mystery. Is she smiling? Is she sad? Is she mocking us? The answer shifts depending on where you look and what mood you're in. Leonardo worked on the Mona Lisa for years, possibly more than a decade. He carried it with him wherever he traveled. He never delivered it to the man who commissioned it. He kept making tiny adjustments, perfecting the sfumato, refining the background landscape. The painting became an obsession, the ultimate expression of his technique and philosophy. But there's something deeper going on. The landscape behind Lisa is not realistic. It's a surreal vision of rivers, mountains, and bridges, a world that looks both ancient and imaginary. Some scholars believe Leonardo was trying to paint the Earth itself, the timeless geological forces that shape the planet. The woman in the foreground is mortal, ephemeral, a momentary spark of consciousness. The landscape behind her is eternal, indifferent, vast. The painting becomes a meditation on mortality and time, on the fragility of human life against the backdrop of nature's immensity. And yet, that enigmatic smile suggests that Lisa knows something we don't. Maybe she's at peace with her mortality. Maybe she sees the joke in our desperate striving for permanence. Or maybe Leonardo was simply showing us that the deepest truths are always ambiguous, always just beyond our ability to fully grasp. In 1513, Leonardo left Italy for the last time. He was 61 years old, and the political situation had become unbearable. The French had lost Milan, the Medici had returned to Florence, and Rome was dominated by Michelangelo and Raphael, who were painting the Vatican while Leonardo wandered unemployed. He accepted an invitation from Francis I, the young king of France, who admired Leonardo's genius and offered him a generous pension. Leonardo moved to a small manor house in Amboise in the Loire Valley, where he spent the last 3 years of his life. He brought 3 paintings with him: the Mona Lisa, St. John the Baptist, and Virgin and Child with St. Anne. He worked on them intermittently, but mostly he rested. He organized his notebooks, he received visitors, he designed a palace for the king that was never built. He sketched plans for canals. He drew apocalyptic visions of floods and storms, as if he could see the end of the world. In May 1519, Leonardo died, probably from a stroke. Vasari, the Renaissance biographer, claimed that Leonardo died in the arms of King Francis, but this was likely a romantic invention. The truth was probably quieter and sadder. Leonardo died in a foreign land, far from home, his notebooks unpublished, most of his projects unfinished, his greatest engineering ideas unrealized. He believed he had wasted his life. There was another obsession running through Leonardo's life, one that began in the hills around Vinci and never truly released him: flight. As a child, he watched birds ride invisible currents above the fields. As an adult, he refused to accept that the sky belonged to them alone. He studied wings not as symbols, but as machines. He drew the shoulder of a bird, the angle of individual feathers, the way a wing twists during a turn, and the subtle changes in shape that create lift. He noticed that a bird does not simply beat the air downward. It leans against moving air, redirects it, and constantly adjusts to currents the human eye can barely see. Leonardo filled pages with flying devices: hinged wings operated by pedals, gliders with adjustable surfaces, parachutes shaped like pyramids, and the famous aerial screw that resembles a primitive helicopter. Many of these machines could never have worked as drawn.
Human muscles do not produce enough power to flap enormous wings while also lifting the weight of the pilot and the machine. Leonardo eventually moved closer to the truth. He began to separate powered flight from gliding. He considered balance, control, air resistance, and the position of a pilot's center of gravity. He even described air as if it were a physical substance, something a wing could push against and something that could push back. This was a crucial leap. Air looks empty, but Leonardo understood that emptiness can have structure and force. He designed a device to measure wind speed and imagined testing flying machines from hills over water, where a fall might be less deadly. There is no reliable evidence that he ever built and flew a full-scale machine, despite the legends. But that almost misses the point. He was not predicting a modern airplane bolt by bolt. He was constructing a new way to ask the question. Instead of saying humans cannot fly because nature did not give them wings, he asked what wings actually do. Once the problem was translated from destiny into mechanics, flight became a technical challenge rather than a miracle. 400 years later, engineers would solve it with lightweight structures, engines, propellers, and mathematical aerodynamics. They did not build Leonardo's machines, but they inhabited the intellectual world he had helped imagine, a world in which nature's abilities could be understood, modeled, and recreated. Water fascinated him just as deeply as air, perhaps even more. Leonardo called water the driving force of nature. He watched rivers with the intensity other painters reserved for faces. To most people, water was a resource, an obstacle, or a feature of the landscape. To Leonardo, it was motion made visible. He drew currents curling around rocks, waves colliding, droplets striking pools, and vortices forming behind barriers. He noticed that turbulent water creates recurring patterns, small spirals nested within larger ones. He compared those movements to braided hair, smoke, blood, and storms. At a time when many Europeans still explained fossils on mountains as debris from the biblical flood, Leonardo examined shells embedded in rock and reached a more patient conclusion. Those mountains had once been beneath ancient seas. Layers of sediment had accumulated over immense periods, hardened into stone, and then been lifted. Rivers did not merely pass through landscapes, they shaped them, grain by grain. This understanding pushed Leonardo toward a vision of Earth that was dynamic and very old. The planet had a body, circulation, erosion, and transformation. He compared rivers to veins, springs to blood vessels, and the ocean to a vast reservoir in the body of the world. Some of these analogies were wrong, but the habit behind them was powerful. He was searching for processes rather than isolated facts. His water studies also had immediate practical value.
Italian rulers needed canals for transport, irrigation, defense, and commerce. Leonardo surveyed riverbeds, designed locks, planned channels, and imagined redirecting the Arno River. One plan could have deprived the enemy city of Pisa of water while giving Florence a navigable route to the sea. The project was too ambitious for the available money, labor, and surveying accuracy, and it failed. But Leonardo continued designing machines to raise water, dredge mud, regulate flow, and reduce destructive flooding. His drawings show gates that distribute pressure, boats that excavate channels, and devices that allow workers to operate from relative safety. He understood that controlling water required respecting its behavior. A rigid wall placed thoughtlessly in a current could create a stronger vortex and destroy itself. The engineer had to cooperate with forces he could not overpower. This lesson appears throughout Leonardo's work.
Nature was not an enemy to defeat. It was a system to read. The closer he observed, the more effective intervention became. His interest in water led naturally to a larger dream, the ideal city. Leonardo had seen Milan struck by plague in the 1480s, when crowded neighborhoods, contaminated water, waste, and poor ventilation turned urban life into a death trap. Tens of thousands may have died. Leonardo did not know about bacteria, but he saw that the shape of a city could influence disease. He began sketching an urban design separated into levels. Goods, animals, carts, and waste would move along lower routes. Pedestrians and homes would occupy cleaner upper streets. Broad avenues would allow light and air to circulate. Canals would carry supplies and remove filth. Staircases would be designed for easy movement, and buildings would be arranged with an attention to sanitation that cities would not routinely adopt for centuries. This was not merely architecture.
It was systems thinking applied to public health. Leonardo saw that a sick city could not be repaired by treating one person at a time. Streets, water, transport, housing, and waste were connected. Change the connections, and you change the lives inside them. Yet his ideal city was never built. Like so many Leonardo projects, it exceeded the political patience and financial commitment of its patrons. A duke might admire a magnificent plan, but prefer to spend his treasury on war, spectacle, or a palace bearing his name. Leonardo depended on such men. This dependence complicates the romantic image of the free genius. He needed workshops, materials, assistance, access to bodies, introductions, protection, and time. All of those came from power. So he wrote flattering letters. He designed festivals that glorified rulers. He imagined weapons for men whose wars devastated ordinary families. He painted mistresses and planned monuments to political dynasties. Curiosity did not place him outside society. It tied him to its compromises. Even his most futuristic ideas had to compete with court gossip, military emergencies, unpaid bills, and patrons whose attention moved faster than his work. Leonardo's career was a negotiation between intellectual freedom and economic dependence. That negotiation still feels familiar. Every ambitious creator needs time and resources resources almost always arrive with expectations. Leonardo's genius lay partly in his ability to use a commission as a doorway. Asked to paint a portrait, he investigated optics, emotion, geology, and the movement of blood beneath skin. Asked to design a pageant, he explored gears, pulleys, light, and theatrical illusion. The patron believed he had purchased an object. Leonardo used the object to investigate the universe. To understand how he painted, you have to understand what he believed vision was. Leonardo did not treat the eye as a passive window. He studied how light strikes surfaces, reflects through air, enters the eye, and becomes perception. He examined shadows and distinguished their different kinds. He observed that the sky makes distant objects appear bluer and less distinct, a principle now called atmospheric perspective. That is why the mountains behind the Mona Lisa seem to dissolve into air rather than sit like cardboard shapes on a painted wall.
He studied how light wraps around a curved face and how reflected color from clothing can subtly enter the skin. He noticed that outlines do not truly exist in nature. A hard black line around a cheek is an artistic convention, not something the eye encounters in life. Real forms emerge through transitions of light, color, and shadow. This insight became sfumato, Leonardo's famous smoky blending. But sfumato was not only a visual effect, it reflected a philosophy. The world does not always announce where one thing ends and another begins.
A smile forms across muscles too small and fleeting to isolate. Emotion passes through a face before language catches it. Leonardo painted that uncertainty. He understood another perceptual trick as well. The center of human vision sees detail more sharply than its edges. When you look directly at the Mona Lisa's mouth, the smile seems restrained. When you look at her eyes, letting the mouth fall into peripheral vision, soft shadows make the smile appear stronger. The expression changes because your own visual system completes it differently. In that sense, the viewer helps paint the face. Leonardo's pictures are not static objects delivering a single answer. They are instruments that expose the machinery of seeing. His study of optics extended into mirrors, lenses, camera obscura effects, and the geometry of reflected rays. He asked whether the eye sends something outward or receives images from the world, a question debated since antiquity.
Through observation, he moved toward the idea that light enters the eye. He made mistakes about how the image was processed, but he insisted that painting depended on knowledge. The painter had to understand anatomy to show movement, geometry to construct space, geology to shape landscape, botany to draw plants, and optics to make light believable. Painting, in Leonardo's hierarchy, was not decoration. It was the discipline capable of uniting all visible knowledge on one surface. That ambition explains the notebooks. Thousands of surviving pages confront us with a mind thinking in real time. There are polished diagrams, hurried reminders, shopping lists, jokes, calculations, designs, maps, fables, prophecies, and questions that seem to arrive faster than he can record them. On one page, he reminds himself to examine a goose's foot. On another, to ask an artillery expert about the force of cannon fire. Elsewhere, he tells himself to obtain a human skull, study the jaw of a crocodile, describe the tongue of a woodpecker, or investigate how ice forms. The lists are thrilling because they feel modern. They also reveal the cost of limitless curiosity. Every answer generated several new questions. Leonardo could spend a morning studying the muscles of the lips because he wanted to paint a smile, then become absorbed in speech, the tongue, nerves, emotion, and the structure of the skull. A practical task opened into an endless tunnel. His mirror writing adds to the sense of mystery, but it was probably less a secret code than a natural method for a left-handed writer who wanted to avoid dragging his hand through wet ink. He often wrote quickly, abbreviated freely, and composed for himself rather than an audience. That private quality allowed intellectual honesty. He could write an idea, contradict it later, draw over it, return years afterward, and leave a problem unresolved.
But privacy also limited his influence. He planned treatises on anatomy, painting, water, mechanics, and flight. None reached publication in the complete form he imagined. He possessed material that could have transformed several fields, yet it remained scattered across loose sheets and bound volumes. After his death, the notebooks passed through collectors, heirs, libraries, and royal archives. Pages were separated. Some vanished. Others were rediscovered centuries later, when the knowledge they contained had already been independently developed. This is one of the strangest tragedies in intellectual history. Leonardo saw further than many contemporaries, but he did not build the communication system required to carry others to the same view. Knowledge that remains inside one mind, however brilliant, cannot become a scientific tradition. Science advances not only through discovery, but through publication, replication, criticism, shared methods, and communities that preserve results.
Leonardo mastered observation. He never mastered release. Even his maps reveal how differently he saw. While working for Cesare Borgia, Leonardo traveled through central Italy, inspecting fortresses, roads, rivers, and defenses. Military maps of the period were often symbolic, distorted, or designed to show ownership rather than accurate spatial relationships. Leonardo produced views with astonishing clarity. He measured distances by pacing or using instruments, noted directions, and translated uneven land into coherent geometry. His map of Imola looks startlingly modern, a city seen directly from above, its streets and walls arranged with precision, even though no human observer could hover at that height. To create it, Leonardo had to synthesize many ground-level observations into an impossible viewpoint. He mentally rose above the city. This ability to move between close detail and total system may be the deepest pattern in his work. He could examine the tiny valves inside a heart and then imagine circulation through the body. He could draw grains of sediment moving in a current and then see mountains shaped over ages. He could study one muscle at the corner of a mouth and use it to create a portrait that seems psychologically alive. The same habit governed his machines. He drew gears, bearings, springs, screws, chains, and cams as reusable mechanical elements. Instead of seeing each machine as a unique object, he created a visual vocabulary of motion. Rotation could become alternating movement. A screw could convert turning into pressure. A gear could change speed or direction. Once these elements were understood, they could be recombined. This was not yet modern mechanical engineering, but it pointed toward it. Leonardo also understood that diagrams could make invisible action visible. He used cutaway views, exploded arrangements, layers, and multiple perspectives to reveal how parts relate. In anatomy, he drew bones from several angles and removed layers one by one. In machinery, he separated components so the reader could imagine assembly. These techniques are ordinary in modern manuals because generations adopted them. In Leonardo's pages, they feel like the invention of visual explanation itself. He was not merely drawing what objects looked like, he was drawing how knowledge should be organized. And yet, the closer you look, the harder it becomes to separate visionary Leonardo from legendary Leonardo. Popular culture often credits him with inventing nearly every modern machine. The helicopter, the tank, the submarine, the bicycle, the robot, even devices his notebooks do not clearly support. This turns a fascinating historical person into a magician who somehow downloaded the future. The truth is more impressive because it is more human. Leonardo borrowed ideas. He studied earlier engineers, ancient authors, workshop traditions, military devices, and machines already circulating in illustrated manuscripts. He improved some concepts, misunderstood others, and drew many possibilities that remained speculative. His armored vehicle contained a gearing arrangement that, as drawn, would not function properly. His aerial screw could not lift a pilot with Renaissance materials and power. Some weapon designs may have been intended as demonstrations of ingenuity rather than buildable plans. Genius did not mean freedom from error. Leonardo's strength was the quality of his attention and the range of connections he made, not supernatural isolation from his culture. He stood inside networks of craftsmen, mathematicians, doctors, artists, patrons, assistants, and rivals. He learned from them and was constrained by them. Recognizing this does not shrink him. It rescues him from mythology. If Leonardo was a magical exception, his example teaches us nothing. If he was a human being who trained observation, tolerated uncertainty, crossed boundaries, borrowed freely, made mistakes, and returned obsessively to difficult questions, then parts of his method become available to us. The legend says genius arrives fully formed. The notebooks say genius is page after page of unfinished work. The image of Leonardo working alone by candlelight is powerful, but it can also mislead us. Renaissance art was rarely the product of one isolated pair of hands. Leonardo maintained workshops, employed assistants, trained pupils, shared living space, and relied on people who prepared panels, ground pigment, copied drawings, managed clothing, carried letters, arranged payments, and helped turn ideas into physical objects. Two companions became especially important in his later life. Gian Giacomo Caprotti, nicknamed Salai, entered Leonardo's household as a boy and remained connected to him for decades.
Leonardo described him with a mixture of affection and exasperation, calling him troublesome, greedy, and dishonest, yet buying him clothes, keeping him close, and eventually leaving him property. Francesco Melzi, a young Milanese nobleman, became a more disciplined pupil and trusted heir. He accompanied Leonardo to France and inherited the notebooks after his death. Through Melzi, at least part of Leonardo's intellectual world survived. These relationships remind us that even an extraordinary mind needs ordinary forms of support. Someone to find materials, preserve papers, listen to unfinished ideas, and remain present through years of uncertainty. Much about Leonardo's intimate life is unknown. He never married and had no acknowledged children. At 24, he and several other young men were anonymously accused of sexual relations with a male prostitute. The charge was dismissed for lack of evidence, but in Florence, such an accusation could carry severe consequences.
Historians continue to debate Leonardo's sexuality, and certainty is impossible. What can be said is that he guarded his private self. His notebooks reveal relentless curiosity, but little direct confession. He records the architecture of the heart more readily than the history of his own heart. This emotional reserve may be one reason people project so much onto him. The absence of a clear personal narrative creates space for the simple, the sorcerer, the secret heretic, the tormented outsider, or the perfect genius. But Leonardo was not a symbol while he was alive. He was a person who worried about money, argued over payments, bought bright clothing, enjoyed jokes, cared about beautiful faces, kept animals, moved repeatedly, disappointed patrons, and aged. Accounts describe him as physically graceful and socially charming, a musician able to improvise on a silver lyre. This matters because genius is often portrayed as a narrow beam of intellect that burns away ordinary personality.
Leonardo seems to have been more contradictory, sociable but private, elegant but willing to work with decomposing bodies, gentle toward animals, yet willing to design weapons, hungry for perfection, yet surrounded by unfinished work. The contradictions are not flaws in the story. They are the story. They show a mind pulled by competing desires, beauty and accuracy, freedom and patronage, recognition and secrecy, completion and endless investigation. Perhaps this is why his life feels so contemporary. Many people know what it is to have more interests than time, to confuse preparation with progress, to protect a project until it never meets the world, or to fear that unfinished work cancels everything already learned. Leonardo's life does not offer a neat cure. It offers a warning and a consolation. Curiosity without discipline can scatter achievement, but an unfinished search can still alter the boundaries of imagination. The challenge is not to imitate his incompletion. It is to inherit his attention while learning to share what attention discovers. So why do we remember Leonardo da Vinci as the ultimate genius? Not because he finished everything he started. He didn't. Not because he changed the world in his lifetime. He didn't. Most of his engineering designs were never built. His anatomical discoveries were not published until centuries after his death. He completed fewer than 20 paintings in his entire life. By the standards of his own time, Leonardo was a brilliant failure, a man who promised much and delivered little. But here's what Leonardo did accomplish. He showed us what a human mind is capable of when it refuses to accept limits. He looked at the world and saw not a collection of separate things, but a unified system governed by invisible laws. He approached painting as a science,
science as an art, and engineering as a form of philosophy.
He believed that curiosity was the highest virtue, that observation was more valuable than authority, and that understanding was worth more than fame or wealth. He was not trying to be a Renaissance man. That label was applied to him later. He was simply trying to see clearly, to understand deeply, to grasp the fundamental patterns that connect everything. And in pursuing that impossible goal, he created works of such beauty and insight that they still astonish us 5 centuries later. The Mona Lisa's smile, the swirling drama of the Last Supper, the anatomical drawings that look like they were made with a modern textbook open beside him, the helicopter sketches, the tank designs, the geological vision of a planet shaped by water over eons. These are not just artifacts of history. They are proof that one human being, given enough curiosity and discipline, can see further than the rest of us. They are proof that genius is not about being good at one thing. It's about connecting everything, seeing the pattern that links art to science, structure to function, beauty to truth. Leonardo da Vinci was the ceiling of human potential, the furthest one person has ever reached in multiple directions at once. He could not be replicated then, and he cannot be replicated now. Not because we lack his talent, but because the world no longer allows it. Our age demands specialization. We train people to be experts in one field, to dig deeper and deeper into narrower and narrower topics. Leonardo lived in a brief historical window when it was still possible for one person to make original contributions to art, science, engineering, anatomy, and philosophy simultaneously. That window has closed. But Leonardo's life offers us something more valuable than nostalgia. It offers us permission. Permission to follow our curiosity wherever it leads, even if it leads away from our career path. Permission to ask questions that don't have immediate applications. Permission to fail at grand projects rather than succeed at small ones. Permission to look at a bird's wing or a river's current and wonder how it works. Leonardo's notebooks contain a line that might be his epitaph. "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have." He died believing he had failed. But 500 years later, we look at what he left behind, and we see not failure, but a map of what human consciousness can achieve when it is fully awake, fully alive, fully engaged with the mystery of existence. That is his legacy. Not the paintings, though they are sublime. Not the inventions, though they were visionary. But the example of a mind that never stopped asking why.